Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Welcome to tonight's live stream. Sorry I'm a little late. We're having technical issues. We're trying to run things through the camera right over there, and it's not working out. Unfortunately, I wanted to set things up tonight on the live stream with the set that we've been building on. You guys have been watching the Rebel Capitalist channel. I've rented space for my good buddy Robert and Kim. And I had things set up on Friday pretty well, but unfortunately now the cameras, I can't get it to work. So we'll just have to do the live stream from this angle, and I'll have to figure it out later on. I want to strongly encourage all of you to check out rebelcapitalistlive.com. That is the live event that I'm doing in Houston this January 7th through the 9th. Ron Paul, G. Edward Griffin, my good friend, Lynn Alden, Chris Cole, and many, many more. It's one thing to learn from these individuals when I'm interviewing them on the Rebel Capitalist show, but it takes it to a whole new level when you're able to sit down and meet with these people face to face and hear their presentations, but probably more importantly, meet with your fellow Rebel capitalists that are in the community. I cannot stress how important that is in today's day and age, that we all come together, we meet each other, we feed off that positive energy so we can stand up and fight for freedom. So check that out at rebelcapitalistlive.com. The last event we had in June, I had to stop selling tickets a month and a half prior to the event because we sold out. We'll most likely hit capacity for this next one. So make sure you don't wait too long and grab those tickets. All right, let's dive into the questions. What do we got going on today? Hopefully got some Evergrande questions. That's been pretty cool from a macro standpoint. Okay, can you explain how the Fed raising interest rates affects the real economy and our national debt? All right, so first of all, let's assume that the national debt is, what, 29 trillion? We'll just call it 30 trillion. They have to, that's not a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So what I mean by that is, call it 10 or 11 trillion of that debt is very short term, meaning they have to roll it over within the year. So what would happen if the government has to pay back 10 trillion of that debt within the next 12 months? Well, what they would have to, obviously they don't have the money to do that. So they would have to issue more bonds to pay off the debt that is coming due within the next year in this hypothetical example. And the numbers are pretty close to accurate. So let's just say that the Fed allowed the Fed funds rate to go from 0% up to, let's say they let it normalize. So it goes up to something that we have seen over the past, call it 150 years, averaged out, maybe 5-6%. So that means the government would have to roll over 10 trillion in debt instead of at a, call it 1%, they'd have to roll it over at 5% or 6%. So think about what that would do to their interest payments. Well, they would go through the roof. Just think about what would happen to your mortgage if your interest rate went from, call it 5% up to 15%. What would happen to your payments? most likely you couldn't afford to make them anymore. And that's exactly the problem if short-term interest rates were to go even up to their normal levels, not even factoring in what might happen if they go to the levels that we saw with Paul Volcker when he had to break the back of inflation in 1980-81 by taking the short-term Fed funds rate up to roughly 18%. So then what does that do to the long end of the curve? The Fed has a lot less control over the long end of the curve. There are a lot more market forces at work there, although there's market forces at the short end as well. And we know that with the pristine collateral that's needed in the repo market. And what I'm referring to specifically are those T-bills, the Treasury bills. But on the long end of the curve, let's focus on the 10-year Treasury. There are a lot of interest rates that are kind of tied at the hip to the 10-year Treasury. First and foremost, mortgage rates. So if mortgage rates, or excuse me, if the 10-year Treasury, I believe now it's at about 1.3% roughly, let's just say that normalizes and goes up to 8%. Well, all those people out there that have an adjustable rate mortgage, and a lot of the commercial debt that can't get fixed rate debt, or a lot of the commercial players out there, the commercial real estate investors, it's tougher for them to get that fixed rate debt. So let's say they have to roll over their debt, just like the example I gave earlier with the federal government, and their current debt obligation or their interest payments, maybe 5%, let's say that goes up to 10%. Well, now all of a sudden they got a big problem. And then you start to see a lot of defaults. Credit card interest, what is it now? 22%? Okay, well, if the 10-year goes to 6, 7, 8%, well, what's going to happen to credit card interest? Going to go way up. What happens to payments? Go way up. So that means it's less affordable for the average Joe and Jane, which means they can buy less. Well, if they can buy less in an economy that's 70% consumer spending, what does that do to GDP? Let's think about car loans. Right now, I don't know what the going rate is on a car loan, but I would assume it's at probably close to historic lows. I don't know, 2%, 3%, I don't know. But so you think about all these Americans that are driving around in these fancy cars that look brand new, and we say, oh my, like someone from Colombia would come here and just automatically assume that everyone in the United States is rich just by driving down the street because everyone's driving a new fancy car. They don't understand that the reason they have or giving the perception of being rich is because that monthly payment for that Mercedes Benz is the same as the payment on a Chevy Aveo in Medellin, Colombia, because the interest rate on that car loan in Medellin, Colombia would be 15%, if not more, and that car loan in the United States would be, let's say, 2%, right? So the bottom line is the government would have a very hard time funding itself. You'd have, I mean, you want to talk about deficit, my goodness gracious. And that would probably put a lot of strain on the dollar. It would, boy, it's weird though, from a standpoint of deflation and inflation, that would create a lot of deflationary pressures. Then what is the government's response to that? Do they print even more money? That's a very interesting dynamic with a lot of cross currents. And I don't know what the highest probable outcome would be, but it would be less. It would be less goods and services. It would be less GDP, and the standard of living would definitely go down. It's just, does it go? Do you have this deleveraging with a deflationary environment or an inflationary environment? I don't know. It really all depends on how the dollars are being created. Going back to, you know, this theory that I have that of the three systems that we see at play. Is it the commercial banks that are in charge of the majority of lending, therefore dollar creation? Is it this hybrid system with the government and the Federal Reserve monetizing the debt? Or do we see something that's closer to a central bank digital currency where they are pumping the dollars, let's say, directly into the economy from the Fed's balance sheet, in which case it wouldn't really matter how much deflationary pressure we have from businesses crumbling or from consumer purchasing power going down. It wouldn't matter because the Fed could just create the purchasing power, which again doesn't mean that we're any richer. In fact, we're getting poorer, because the definition of the society or the wealth in a society is how efficiently it can create goods and services. You would just see, you know, inflation going up and standard of living going down. But that's, in a nutshell, that's why interest rates are so important, and that's why, or that's how they can affect the real economy and the national debt. Okay, I want to make sure the audio, because I'm doing this from my desktop and I haven't done it from my desktop in a long time. So, I'll get back to the questions just momentarily, but how is the audio here? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. Audio's good. All right, let me get back to the questions. And I guess I can't go back up to the top, so we'll have to just kind of mix it up today. Question: Are treasuries a safe haven if a market event is imminent? Well, what are you talking about? Because there's multiple types of treasuries. Are we talking about like 30-year treasuries? Are we talking about T-bills? Um, if you're talking about T-bills, I think that is a safe haven, especially if your objective is just to keep some dry powder to take advantage of the market, the stock market going down, or whatever it is that you want to buy with dollars. Now, there's most likely going to be a negative carry on that because, of course, we're seeing significant consumer price inflation. But I would argue that having some cash on the sidelines is worth the negative carry, just because of the value and the opportunity that could arise from those assets that you want to buy that are denominated in dollars actually going down in nominal value and you being able to take advantage of that. Now, treasuries on the long end, though, like a 30-year treasury, no, I think that's not even close to a safe haven. I mean, think about that for a moment. What's the yield on the 30 years? 1.8, 2%? Well, we know that inflation is running at, I mean, optimistically 5. I would say it's probably closer to 8 or maybe even 10. So you've got a negative real yield. You're guaranteed to lose money. So I don't know how that would be a safe haven, and it would be horrible for dry powder because any move in the interest rate up would disproportionately affect the bonds at the long end of the curve. And in other words, if we have, let's say, a 0.5% move in the yield at the long end of the curve on the 10-year or the 30-year, those prices would go down a lot further than if you had a 50 basis point move at the short end of the curve. So because of the duration. So no, that's the opposite of a safe haven. Uh, that's why I wanted to compartmentalize that, because if you're talking about, very short-term T-bills that you're just rolling over and you don't have much of that interest rate risk, it's just more that short-term inflation risk, then I think that can be a good place to store dry powder, especially if it's a large sum, because you don't really want the counterparty as the commercial banking system if you feel as though the current banking system is built on a foundation of sand. Do I do I buy platinum? No, I've never bought platinum. No, I bought a lot of commodities back in March of 2020. I bought a lot of uranium and coal, oil, and some others I'm probably forgetting. Gold miners, I remember that, but didn't buy palladium. I hadn't even checked it, but I was listening to macro voices. Well, I checked it a while back, and I knew that uranium was doing well. I didn't know how well it was doing until I listened to macro voices on Thursday night, and my good buddies Eric Townsend and Patrick Serezna went over the recent price move in uranium. So that turned out to be a really good investment. But I'm not selling, because if you look at a long-term historical chart, uranium is not expensive yet. So it was definitely cheap when I bought it back in March of 2020, that's for sure. But it is not expensive yet. Now, oil is more interesting because I bought a lot of oil when it was under 30 a barrel. Right around 20, I think, is when I started buying the producers in March. And because looking at a long-term chart, from what I can tell, it looks like when it gets under 30, adjusted for inflation, that oil is usually kind of quote unquote cheap. But once it gets over 80, it starts to kind of get expensive, and then you see it mean revert. So I know we're close to 80, so I'm not sure how I'll sell and kind of wind down the investment if we get up to 80, 90. I won't do it all one time. I'll probably use options to get paid while I wait, but that's something we talk about in Rebel Capitalist Pro all the time. It's a strategy that Lynn Alden uses. I believe I was talking to her. It's been a while since I've talked to Lynn, but if my memory serves me well, that's a strategy that she implements quite often. And Chris McIntosh does that. I'm sure Tony Greer, and I'm sure Patrick Ceresna do it a lot. And those are all, though everyone I named there is a pro in Rebel Capitalist Pro. What is a libertarian solution for problems that spring up from free markets, such as factory farming? Well, I'm not sure what factory farming is, but I'm guessing it's that 90% of our food comes from 5 giant corporations in the United States. I think and I don't know this specifically, but usually when we get close to a monopoly situation, it's a result of the government creating regulations that make it prohibitive for businesses, smaller businesses, to start and compete with the big guys. I was listening to an interview from Richard Werner today, and I'm actually having the opportunity to interview Richard tomorrow, which I'm really excited about. I know a lot of you have been wanting to see that interview for quite some time, and I've been wanting to interview Professor Werner for quite some time. So it's great that it's finally coming to fruition. But he was talking about one of the main reasons it's been so hard for these local community banks, especially in Europe, to compete with the big banks. And that's his kind of one of his main solutions to our current problems, is to get the lending back into the hands of the smaller community banks that have a relationship with their customer and with those businesses, so we can start growing the amount of goods and services and providing capital for those small and mid-sized enterprises that are really the lifeblood of a healthy economy, instead of having the huge banks just lend to huge customers, which are pretty much these giant corporations that are all getting bailed out from the Federal Reserve already, or these giant hedge funds like Bridgewater and the like. So, but he made the point that the reason that you've had such a consolidation is because now it's very difficult for a small bank to start up and compete, because they have the same they have to abide by the same regulatory restrictions, not just the regulatory restrictions, but they have to abide by all of the bureaucracy and red tape that the big banks or that apply to the big banks. So there's a cost to that. So let's just say that your cost of compliance for a bank is $10 million a year. Well, that's the cost for JP Morgan. Actually, it's probably a lot more than that, but let's just say it's 10 million for JP Morgan. For a local small bank, it's not like it would be 100,000. For a local small bank, it might be 9 million, but it's very close to the cost that you'd see with JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or B of A. So how on earth can a small bank compete with that? It can't. So effectively, they get completely priced out of the market. And by doing all these things that are quote unquote for the greater good and to keep the consumer safe and protected, what they do is they just consolidate and centralize the power of banking into a small group that, again, only gives loans to giant hedge funds and giant corporations. So that means that there's fewer loans going to the small and mid-sized enterprises, the SMEs, that make up the majority of solid, sustainable economic growth. And I would assume that there's a similar type of environment in the farming business where, the same thing in tobacco with in the 1990s. All of those laws and restrictions that came down on the tobacco companies basically created monopolies so no one can compete. And so my point is, whenever you see a quote unquote problem that most people associate with the free market, it's usually not a problem that was created by the free market. It's usually a problem that was created by government. And that's why, by the way, so many of these big corporations are favor an increase in the minimum wage. Sure, because it just eliminates all their competition, because they're the only ones that can afford to pay the minimum wage. So you see how this kind of circle goes from the big corporations to the big government, back to the big corporations, and then the lobbyists are paying all this money, let's say, to the politicians to do the bidding of the Walmarts and the JP Morgans of the world, or maybe in this case it's Monsanto. And so the solution is not we need less of a free market. The solution is we need more of a free market, and we need to shrink the size of government. So I'm not saying we need to eliminate the government, but you need to have a very, very small, limited federal government so they don't have the power to screw things up and create an environment where monopolies are far more likely. What's the probability of a gold-backed Chinese digital yuan? Well, I think it's a lot more than zero. I mean, I don't know if I had to give it an actual, I'd say, 10%, something like that. I think Luke Groman would probably say it's even higher than that. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if you listen to my recent interview with my buddy Luke, I kind of got the vibe. He was saying something to that effect, because we were talking about the decline of the petrodollar and how Saudi Arabia is signing this military deal, or has signed this military deal with Russia. And the premise of the petrodollar was the United States provides Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations military and protection, and in turn they price their oil in dollars. Therefore, it always creates this artificial bid for dollars, so that we can borrow at very low rates. And by the way, when they get those dollars, the kind of wink wink nod nod deal is that Saudi Arabia, as an example, prices their oil in dollars, they get the dollars, and then they go buy US Treasuries. So that keeps the borrowing costs extremely low for the United States, and low for the consumers. That goes back to the 10-year Treasury being at artificially low interest rates. A lot of that is because of the dollar. So we just outlined how that could affect the economy negatively if interest rates go up, but you see how the inverse could be true, that if the petrodollar is allowing us to have artificially low interest rates, by definition, is also allowing us to maintain a higher standard of living than we would otherwise enjoy if it were just based on our productivity. So at the end of that conversation, he says that they may initially settle, and again, I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth. You guys will have to watch the interview. But he said that they may transition from settling in dollars to, they meaning the Saudis or the OPEC nations with other countries purchasing oil. So go from settling in dollars to settling in rubles, and he thought eventually they would go to settle in gold. Now, if that's a result of them settling in digital yuan that is backed by gold, I think that's kind of a more extensive discussion. But I think that there's a lot. Oh, let me just put it this way, because again, I don't want to talk for Luke, but I would assume there's a lot of very smart and brilliant macro thinkers that would give the probability of that over, maybe even over 20%. So I think that's something that if you're really trying to figure out the macro environment and what it may look like at a global level in the next 5 years, you definitely need to consider, for sure. I haven't done much work on the rupee or India at all, Harry. Let me read your question. Need your insight on the Indian rupee, since it's the only economy with good balance sheet and stock market this time of the year. Do you think countries like India, Russia decouple from the dollar? Yeah, I think they'll gradually decouple from the dollar. We've got to realize that usually when a country loses its reserve currency status, it's a very slow unwind. It's not something that just kind of happens overnight. In fact, I don't know of any time in history where the country has lost that reserve status in shorter than in less than maybe a decade. People, you might want to go back to Bretton Woods in 1944, but that's not really when we went on to a dollar standard. The dollar started to transition into the world reserve currency back in the 1920s. So although now there are so many dollars outside of the United States, I think there is an argument that it could happen within a year or two time frame, a much more compressed time frame. But I still think the probability is pretty low. But more towards your question, I think the probability of India, Russia, and China continuing to decouple from their dependency on the dollar, or I think the whole global economy is that's kind of the direction they're going. And a lot of it will depend on what the dollar does against other currencies, what the interest rates are, and how quickly the dollar goes up or down. If we go back to why there is so much dollar-denominated debt in the world right now, and what is dollar-denominated debt? In a way, that's just future dollar demand, right? Because you've got to come up with those dollars to make those payments or to pay off the principal. So we go back to, I don't have a chart in front of me, but let's just say roughly 2012. And we saw the DXY all the way down at like 70. So what countries, and then the Fed had the interest rates at the zero lower bound. So you had all these countries and foreign corporations say, hey, man, I could borrow in Colombian pesos at a 12% interest rate, or I could borrow in dollars at a 4% interest rate, and the dollar has gone down from, call it 90 all the way to 70 over the last 3 years, and all my economists are saying that it's going to continue to go down. So why wouldn't I borrow in dollars when the interest rate is so much lower, and most likely I'll be able to pay off that debt with cheaper dollars? Now, what actually happened is the complete opposite, which is why we have the big problem today in a lot of these emerging markets, because instead of the dollar going from 70 to 50, it went from 70 to 100. So that's a big problem. So, but if the debt, or excuse me, the dollar goes down very quickly, then that alleviates a lot of that pressure. That's going to be a different decision making process for those entities that are rolling over that debt and trying to decide if they want to roll it over in their local currency or continue to borrow in dollars or maybe go to a Chinese digital yuan. There's a lot of moving parts there, but we need to pay attention to all of them because this is something that's absolutely crucial to the direction of the dollar, which is crucial to knowing how long the dollar is going to survive as the global reserve currency. Hey, Parcero. That's a term that they use in Medellin. Says, "Hey, Parcero, George, when are you coming back to Medellin? Loved the real estate project videos." I can't wait to come back, but I'm not going to go back until they've gotten rid of all the restrictions. My employees told me that they still have mask mandates indoors and stuff, and I know no one's really paying attention to the rules, but I'll be back when everything's back to normal, and I can't wait for that time. What do you think about them trying to ban cash and move to a world digital currency? I think this is very probable. Whether they can pull it off or not, I, I don't know. But this is their intention. And so who is they? Let's define that first and foremost. They would be the IMF. And they would also be the World Economic Forum. When you look at the relationship between the two groups, it's pretty much like the relationship between central bankers or government officials, treasury secretaries, and Goldman Sachs. They're just kind of it's kind of rotate. So the belief system is kind of one and the same, or the narrative. And if you listen to the IMF, they are really pushing the SDR, the special drawing right, which is basically the fiat currency of the IMF that they can create. And they want the digital SDR to be the global reserve asset that banks hold, excuse me, commercial central banks hold on their balance sheet. So they want this to replace gold. They want this to replace other fiat currencies, i.e., the dollar, as a reserve asset on the balance sheet of, let's say, the Central Bank of Colombia. Why? Obvious reasons. It gives them all the power. This is, if you go back and look at the whiteboard video I did last week, you'll see that we talked about the exorbitant privilege and like global dominance that the United States has as a result of having the world reserve currency. Well, if that world reserve currency goes to the SDR, all of the power that the US government has, the IMF would now enjoy. And those, although I don't like any group, any central planners to have that type of power, at least in the United States, theoretically, we can vote them out of office. With the IMF, nobody's voting on them. They just get to vote themselves in, I guess. I'm not sure who does the hiring over at the IMF, but it's not you and me. That's for sure. So I think they'll, I mean, just read what they're saying, and they're definitely promoting the idea. And so they'll try to do it, but whether they will succeed, I think that's a different question. It will all depend on how things play out with the dollar, going back to that last question, and how quickly it were to have a move down or up. I mean, if it goes up just within the span of 2 or 3 months to 120 or 130, then you could see it really crush emerging market economies. It would crush foreign national corporations outside the United States that don't have cash flow in dollars. It would create havoc, which would most likely prompt them to come in with a to intentionally come in and devalue the dollar. So a Plaza Accord 2.0, something like that. Okay, do you think a negative change in the economy will be short-lived, 1 to 3 years or more? It really depends on when there is a negative change, who is in charge of the dollar, Leslie. If it is entirely in the hands of the commercial banking system, then you're looking at Japan. So no, not 1 to 3 years. You're talking about decades because of how overlevered everyone's balance sheet is, from the consumer to the corporation to the state to the federal government. I'm talking about the United States. But that's the deflationary Great Depression that Lacey Hunt talks about. He doesn't talk about a Great Depression, but that's kind of the deflationary environment that he talks about, that deflationary deleveraging. If we have this hybrid system, then yeah, I think it could be short-lived because the government would come in with their deficit spending that the Fed would most likely monetize, and that we could go for another round. Who's to say that we can't kick the can down the road even further? But if we have a central bank digital currency and we have a negative change in the economy, then now, so what let me make sure I'm clear. I'm defining a negative turn in the economy as a negative nominal change in asset prices, because so I'm kind of bouncing all over the place here, and I'm assuming that you guys are connecting the dots, but maybe you're not here. So you guys have heard me say all the time that the United States economy, and many economies are like this, not just the United States, but especially the US, is the real economy is predicated upon how well or poorly the stock market does and the housing market. So, and to a certain degree, the bond market. But it's not like it should be. And you would think that the stock market, and some people still believe this to be true, that the stock market somehow implies that the real economy is doing well, because all those businesses represent businesses that are doing business and generating cash flow in the real economy. So stock price is going up. Well, that must mean that those businesses are doing well, and if those businesses are doing well, that must mean the U.S. economy is doing well. That would make a lot of sense, but unfortunately, that's not how it works today. It's just using a very broad term, money printing. It's just a lot of capital flows going into the stock market because the central banks have been pushing people further and further out the risk curve. So you've seen this PE, um, you've seen multiples really compress, and that makes stocks go up, even though the cash flows are very similar, and the profits might even be similar. Then you have all these companies buying all their shares back, so the supply of shares goes down, and then the amount of demand goes up because the amount of money, or M2, the amount of dollars on the balance sheet of non-bank entities, goes up. Therefore, what are stocks going to do, right? And so you've got to think about how much consumer spending is predicated upon people's 401k, their stock portfolio, or more especially their house. That's really most people's net worth is tied up in the equity in their house. So if housing prices have doubled, then people are going to have a lot more purchasing power, even if they haven't done any more work. This is what most people really don't think through, especially Americans. They just kind of accept it as a given because they've never really lived through a bear market. And they didn't live through that time frame between 1925 and 1981 where the stock market was flat when you adjust for inflation. If they lived through that time frame, think about how much lower their purchasing power would be. But they like to think that they're rich because they made good decisions. Maybe, maybe not. But the bottom line is, let's just think through what would happen if the stock market went down by 50% and stayed down by 50%. What would happen if at the same time the real estate market went down by 50% and stayed down by 50%? What would that do to the purchasing power of the United States in aggregate total? It would absolutely plummet. Plummet. So what that tells you is that a good percentage of our purchasing power is not coming from us producing stuff. It's not coming from our productivity. I mean, I'll give you one more example to illustrate my point. Let's say that you're someone that's making $50,000 a year. And back in 2012, you were able to buy a house in, let's just say, California for $200,000. So you saved up, let's say you put whatever, 20,000 down or something, 25,000 down, and you bought a house that was, let's say, 250 grand. Well, let's say today that you have that same job that's making roughly $50,000 a year, but your house has gone from 250,000 up to 1.5 million. Okay, now you've gone from barely getting by to being pretty well off. Most people would consider that rich, depending on where you were. So you've increased your purchasing power by, let's just call it $1.25 million. But how much extra work have you done? How much more productive are you? Are you producing more goods and services? No. And I'm not saying you're a bad person for doing this. You made a good decision that worked well. But the bottom line is that the economy isn't any more wealthy just because you are on paper. You see? So what we're living in right now in the United States is all these people that are going out to eat all the time and buying new cars and going to shows and going to Las Vegas and renting cars and flying on airplanes and going to vacation and doing all the reason many of those people are doing it is simply because their house price went up or their stock portfolio went up. It's not because they're, in fact, most of them are producing less stuff. I mean, on aggregate total, the American population is producing way less than it did in 2009. I don't have to tell you guys that. I'm preaching to the choir there. So our purchasing power has increased, although we produce less. That is unsustainable, right? And especially if the stock market goes down by 50% or the the real estate market goes down by 50%, stays there like we saw in Japan, then you go into a depression for a long, long, long time. Something probably worse than what we saw during the 1930s. So, and it would be long term. Now, I know it was kind of a tangent there, but I thought it was important to really explain that thoroughly. So, but if the central bank comes in and can create inflation, then they can wipe out that debt a lot faster and kind of hit the reset button, to use a Klaus term. We need a great reset. We need a reset of debt for the United States government. That's my Klaus impression for you. But, but now that doesn't make us any richer, because the damage has been done. The distortions have been created by the government spending that much money in the first place. But it could get the debt to GDP down from, call it 130% down to 50, something more manageable. We'd still have a lot of problems, but at least it would clean up the balance sheet a little bit, and it could do it faster. But then we're just back on the same path where it's kind of a phony bubble economy, as my buddy Peter Schiff would say, and we're kind of just kicking the can down the road and buying more time, but it's still this game of musical chairs. When the pendulum swings the other way, how much house would 1 kilogram of gold be able to buy? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. That's a pretty vague question. I don't know, where are you talking about? I don't. What pendulum? I don't know what are you saying, in inflation or housing prices, or I don't know how to answer that question. I don't really understand the question, so it's really hard for me to answer it. I apologize. Okay, just looking for another question, guys. Just bear with me, please. How do you see the deflationary pressures affecting Brent's dollar milkshake theory in the SDR? Okay, so let's just, how can I explain this? I think the easiest way to understand this is to, let's just say that you have a job and you're making $100,000 a year. Well, let's say that you, for some reason, have a mortgage payment, or you have a mortgage that's denominated in Japanese yen. I should probably be doing the opposite example, but we'll just go with it. So then we'll assume that the dollar, quote unquote, collapses. So let's just say that it starts off where there's that they're parity. So $1 equals 1 yen. And then we get to a point where $2 equal 1 yen. Okay, well, what does that do to your debt payment? Let's say your mortgage payment is whatever, $1,000 a month. Okay, well, or let's say it's 1,000 yen per month initially, and then that just stays the same. We'll say you got a fixed rate loan. Okay, well, no, and let's say you're making 100 grand. So let's just say you're making 8 grand a month. So that 1,000 yen would take up $1,000. So you still have $7,000 left over. But if the dollar depreciates that much, so the yen appreciates by 100%, so then to make that mortgage payment, 1,000 yen, it would require $2,000 of your income. Well, now all of a sudden you only have 6,000 left. This starts to become the problem. And let's also think through that how would you get those 1,000 yen if your paycheck is in dollars? Well, what you'd have to do is you would have to take 2,000 of your dollars and you would have to trade them for 1,000 yen. So you are creating more demand for yen and you're creating more supply of dollars. So that would put even further downward pressure on the dollar. All right. So now what we have to understand is all of this debt outside of the United States that's actually denominated in dollars, where those countries or those corporations that have the dollar denominated debt, their income is denominated in a different currency. Just like the example I gave, the income was a different currency than was owed in the mortgage payment. And so if you have this environment where the currency goes up at all, or to any significant degree in with the debt or the debt payments, then that's going to create this positive feedback loop that's going to push that currency up further and further and further. So I should have used I should have flipped it, in my first example. And the debt should have been the dollar and the income in yen. But I think you guys are smart enough to follow that. You guys get it. So really the bottom line is when you have a contrast, when you have a difference, a discrepancy between your income and what your debt payments are denominated in, you get really hurt if the currency that the debt is denominated in appreciates against the currency that your income is denominated in. And then you take more of your currency units from your income and trade them for the currency units to pay off the debt. So that creates that positive feedback loop where you're putting out more supply of the currency of your income to buy the currency of your debt payment to go ahead and make the payment to whomever the lender is. I kind of need a whiteboard for that one, but that's basically the premise of Brent's dollar milkshake theory. And so deflation, that means that incomes are most likely going down, especially if we have a deflationary environment where asset prices are going down. Goes back to that earlier question when I was talking about how dependent the US economy is on asset prices. Well, if that goes down 50%, all of a sudden the spending goes down. One man's spending is another man's income. You see? So incomes go down in dollars, therefore there are fewer dollars going to those corporations to pay off their dollar denominated debt, and it's the exact same process. And then they have to take more of their own currency because they're not earning any dollars and trade that currency for dollars, which creates more supply of their currency, more demand for dollars, and it shoots it straight to the moon. That's basically the dollar milkshake theory. So deflation would create a huge tailwind to Brent's theory. All right, guys, let me do some shout outs. I thank you for hanging out with me this evening. Hopefully next week we'll have the view over here. So we'll have the awesome backdrop, and I'll have all the books I ordered right there. You can see one book we got. The reason I got Rich Dad up here is because see where this green wall, or not, no, not that green wall. the gray wall that's on this side. Just on the other side of that wall is Kiyosaki's storage room. So he's got like thousands of books over there. So I needed some books to put up here as a placeholder. So that's why they're all Kiyosaki. See that one, and there's one him with that one's with him, like I don't know if that's the Dalai Lama or something like that, but it's like in Russian or something. But that's just I'll leave Rich Dad up there for sure. But the other one I just had in my bag is Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And of course, I've got the Fed and the Fed hat. And then we've got some, nice greenery here. And I ordered an Atlas Shrugged statue to go right here, just like our logo. And then I put a couple pictures. I don't know if you can see it. That's actually a picture of me. And that's my mom. I took her to the racetrack in Las Vegas a couple weekends ago. And I was driving a Lamborghini Huracan. So I took my mom out to the racetrack. So that's the picture there. But anyway, all right. Oh, shoot. I've got to take off, guys. So quickly here, we got Malaysia, Numismatic. We got J. Brendan Porter, RR, George Stewart. Who else we got here? Ed Edson, Zabutify in the house. John Goodwin, Gregory Stewart, Travis Jacobs, All-Nighter Hider. All right, guys. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Definitely check out rebelcapitalistlive.com. Get your tickets while there's still some left, and we'll see you on the next video.